I am very excited to be here with you in Cairo. And we're all here because of Aya, so a warm thank you to our kind convener who's organized this really fantastic conference that I am sure will have a very lasting impact. So the title of the talk today is called Towards a Minoritarian Counter-Archive. And my talk will be about Cyprus, where I am from. So before I start, kind of a quick kind of message which comes from, in a sense, the street level of Nicosia, where there's kind of a strong mobility in solidarity with the Palestine movement that is in direct opposition to our shameful government. I think that is important to mention. Okay, so I will start with part one, which is called Minoritarian. And I will start with this sort of the lingering effects of a catastrophe. At 5:30 a.m. on the 20th of July, I wake to the piercing sound of war sirens. Interrupting sleep is an act of violence. My mom would tell me this, accompanied by a stern look when I tried to wake my younger sister. This violent awakening returns every year for as long as I can remember, a recurring reminder of the Turkish invasion of 1974, the moment that marked the division of Cyprus. In this symbolic moment of annual remembrance, the state, the Republic of Cyprus on the south, ruptures my unconscious. It reminds me that I bear a political identity, one that I am called to uphold, a harsh reminder of how deeply I am enmeshed in a vios politikos, a politically qualified life. And here you see a photograph of the border dividing the two communities. The border wall on the south side is also the site of this installation called the operating table that I have been developing with external collaborators for the past 4 years. You can see it here latching onto the dividing wall. I will return to this project. What's this?
No, it's like this X. No, okay. But, sorry, can we...
Is this okay?
I just want to make sure that the Zoom is open. Can we, sorry. Because Zoom closed. So sorry about this, I don't know. Internet got disrupted. Okay, you go ahead and I'll consult. Okay. الانترنت فصل.
Yeah, okay, we're back. The Zoom is working, yeah? Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll briefly zoom way out and look at the map of the Mediterranean Sea. Cyprus's curse is its politically strategic location. Colonial power is produced and sustained through cartographic regimes of spatial mapping, as Nishada Wan, who's in the room, shows in the essay Atlas otherwise. Situated in the eastern Mediterranean, the region has historically been central to imperial and later geopolitical strategies, including British imperial control, in Egypt, Palestine, and India. And more recently, through the use of the British RAF military bases and their attacks on Iran. The contemporary map of Cyprus shows how within such a small island, there are multiple overlapping administrative and military jurisdictions that coexist, So subjects are required to continuously adapt to these shifting territorial regimes. And here you can see some of the different political divisions across the island, the internationally recognized Republic of Cyprus on the south, the unrecognized Turkish Cypriot administration, the two British sovereign bases in yellow, and the UN-controlled buffer zone, the so-called no man's land that you can see here, that stretches for approximately 180 kilometers across the island. So the operating table is situated along the southern edge of this territory. From 1878 to 1960, Cyprus was under British colonial rule, where mapping practices were closely tied to systems of military control, taxation, land registration, and infrastructural planning. Within this administrative framework, British governance has often been understood as reinforcing divisions between the island's two predominant communities, Greek-Cypriots and Turkish-Cypriots. The census helped to strengthen these bi-ethnic divisions and to reinforce the colonial control over this territory. So the census was, in relation to the mappings, one of the main tools used to impose this kind of knowledge grid on these remote territories that would have otherwise been difficult to govern. The name of the operating table here also refers to Michel Foucault's notion of the operating table when he explains how language intersects space through categorization. From the perspective of colonial governance, a minority must remain a minority. In this case, we have a double minority. So in the case of Cyprus, as Christopher Hitchens suggests, one might consider this double minority. Why is it double? Up until 1960, Greek Cypriots experienced marginalization under the governance of more powerful states, the UK and before that Turkey. So within the broader geography of the Eastern Mediterranean, they constituted a relatively small population. At the same time, the Turkish Cypriots occupied a more complex position. Aligned with a larger regional majority, they were yet situated as a distinct minority community on the island. So these two predominant communities, reinforced by the census, were meant to be positioned in this binary rivalry opposition. And there was kind of this constant perpetuation of their kind of linkage to external motherlands. Greece, the Greek identity, and the Turkish identity that was perpetuated by the colonial governance, right? And then there's another kind of layer that is also important that I will not mention now, also the kind of the aspiration of the colonized to aspire to move closer to the colonial subject, something that I've explored elsewhere in relation to Homi Bhabha's writing on colonialism, but I won't mention that now. But there is another element to consider here. Kostas Konstantinou explains how minorities living on the island, Maronites, Latins, Armenians, Gypsies, naturalized Cypriots, and subjects that entered into intercommunal marriages had to choose one of the two ethnicities, Greek Cypriot or Turkish Cypriot. This reinforced this binary rivalry between two communities. The Lino-Vambagi, for example, a lost people that existed on the island for centuries, defied official bicommunal definitions, bringing to the fore a radically local Cypriot communal identity. Historically, this hybrid group did not have a clear official ethno-religious status. Before the independence and the intercommunal conflict, before 1955, there was no sustained history of internal violence, and the island was once described as an ethnographical fruitcake, where different speaking populations were closely interwoven in everyday life. I know this also from the stories that I've heard from my grandparents. But today, the many years of post-colonial division and the aspirations to become colonial by some within the local communities reproduce the division from within. One is reminded of the Turkish proverb, when the axe came into the woods, the tree said, the handle is one of us. Under such conditions, how does one live through these perpetual divisions? But more importantly, how can we think and act beyond it? And I want to refer now to the minor race. And it raises kind of these important questions that were mentioned previously. Who defines a minor race? Who defines minorities? It's important to always return to these assemblages of minorities within the island, and to quote kind of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, how they are in opposition to the organs of state power. These are bands that imply a form that is irreducible to the state, and that this form of exteriority necessarily presents itself as a diffuse and polymorphous war machine. And according to Deleuze and Guattari, the race tribe exists only at the level of an oppressed race. And in the name of the oppression it suffers. There is no race but inferior minoritarian. There is no dominant race. A race is defined not by its purity, but rather by the impurity conferred upon it by a system of domination. So it's important, I think, in this case to highlight how race is, in a way, created by systems of power. And then in part two, I want to talk about an associated concept called the ikoumeni. The ikoumeni is linked to the household, how every kind of citizen has a sort of equal share in a community that is not defined by, for example, a certain kind of aggregate of people. So Zenon of Gideon comes from the modern day, from what is modern day Larnaca in Cyprus, and he developed the notion of the philosophy of Stoicism, a philosophy that has been ironically informed by geopolitical conflict, a way of thinking about how to live within fragmentation itself. Zeno, writing in the 3rd century BC, found Stoicism as a practical philosophy for living within an unstable world. Unlike Plato, Aristotle, Stoicism emerges in a context no longer organized by the stability of a polis, of a city-state, but it emerges after its dissolution and the rise of imperial formations. Within this philosophical shift, there is also a difference from the Platonic notion of having this sort of ideal model that one ascribes to, of having this sort of mythical origin that is related to the notion of the ideal and the copy, which carries strong hierarchical implications and that are very much with us today in the way that nation-states operate, no? For Plato, myth helps establish the idea of the model. So in the remnants of British colonialism, we can see how local communities in Cyprus were often absorbed into these narratives of originary myth, the belief, for example, in this glorious motherland, or motherlands, always in two in terms of this binary rivalry. In this sense, violent and exclusionary politics, and we see it with these genocidal apparatuses, rely on the construction of an idealized origin or model, a purified identity against which populations are judged and excluded, producing asymmetries of power. As Gilles Deleuze reminds us in The Logic of Sense, the Platonic dialectic can be understood as a dialectic of rivalry. In his reversal of Platonism, Deleuze ascribes to myth the defining structure of the Platonic model, As he writes, myth, with its always circular structure, is indeed the story of a foundation. It permits the construction of a model according to which the different pretenders can be judged. Stoicism, by contrast, and I'm talking about the early writing of Stoicism, not its kind of instrumentalization after, shifts attention away from rivalry and towards this collective notion of identity. It preserves the idea of philosophy as a way of life that aspires to allow individuals to remain composed in the face of external events. Stoicism introduces this cosmopolitan perspective in which all humans are understood as citizens of the universe. Very important also in relation to the socio-political today and its enmesh, it's kind of intertwining with ecologies. As later developed by Marcus Aurelius, ethical action is directed not towards individual gain, but towards the common good, dagina. Taken together, these traditions, from Stoic cosmopolitanism to the reversals of the Platonic model, show that what we call the common is never not neutral or given. It's produced through systems that organize difference. 5 minutes, okay. So now I'm going to talk about the counter-archive very quickly. Going back to the buffer zone in Nicosia, the visual field within the buffer zone is regulated through warning signs, barriers, newly installed cameras, infrared cameras, strong lighting, and spatial deterrents that restrict access to parts of this territory, right? The visual field is over-codified. It dominates the identity of the subject that is operating at this border on both sides. The operating table that you see here camouflages its simulated photo recording devices to avoid detection by territorial surveillance. It hides kind of the cameras, right? It's not at the height level of a human being. They're lower down so that they don't raise suspicion. The actual apparatus that you see there that one leans into is based on this reflective kind of stainless steel wire. It has the barbed wire aesthetic that dominates the border. So it operates within this landscape of abandoned buildings and vegetation that is simultaneously over-surveyed but visually inaccessible, a site that is seemingly outside of official recording. So at first sight, it's perceived as a curious object, and it contains a negative cast of a face. And this cast acts as a receptacle, inviting participants to position their head inside it. Once a participant places their head inside this cavity, they encounter two peepholes. What one sees through these peepholes are stereoscopic projections of themselves or whatever happened to be in the camera's frame whilst they were moving around the table. Effectively, this is recreating a depth image. You see yourself in the way that I see you now in depth, but the way that you can never see yourself. So you see a depth image of your face, for example. And this creates a shock in you because you don't expect to see yourself in this way. This is based on the Wheatstone stereoscope, a digitized version of the Wheatstone or mirrored stereoscope. And again, the participant sees themselves in this depth. But something else is also happening within this system. Similar to when you join the Zoom teleconference calls or Teams, the image of the figure is cropped from what would lie behind their visual field, behind their background, and the image of the inaccessible land is stitched behind the viewer, and sometimes there's other images that would not be behind what you would see. So this creates a displacement. And I want to emphasize this notion of displacement because this is a territory where, as I've started to show, the citizens are constantly feeling like they're constantly displaced, like how I was kind of awoken by this sudden siren. This is part of our everyday existence. We constantly live within this disrupted, displaced kind of landscape, right? In different ways, and we need to adapt to different administrative regimes. But in a sense, this displacement becomes productive. It becomes a gain. Why does it become productive? Because it shifts you away from your identity as it has been imposed from the outside. And it does it on the border, on the territory of the border. So one is suddenly kind of taken back by the shock, by this displacement, right? By this dehabituation of the body. Because, again, one sees something that they don't expect to see. They see themselves, first of all, the way that others see themselves, right? In depth. But at the same time, there's a background behind me that isn't there. I'm suddenly in this abandoned territory. And there are these kind of, also a mirroring of surveillance apparatuses that are kind of reflected here. So just very quickly to wrap up, this kind of mechanism of reversing the gaze is bringing kind of an empowerment, in a sense, to the actual kind of inhabitants that live within this territory, within this zone. It reverses kind of the state territorialization, and it kind of brings into effect a state of effective becoming. Thank you.